What crazy things would you do if you thought your future was at stake? That's exactly the dilemma Marty McFly faces when Doc Brown, an eccentric scientist and inventor, accidentally transports him back to the year 1955. Are any of you familiar with the 1985 cult classic film Back to the Future? Marty McFly, played by a youthful Michael J. Fox, travels back to 1955 where he encounters the high school version of his mother and father. He accidentally disrupts the way that they're supposed to meet and fall in love. The way they were supposed to meet and fall in love is that his mother nurses his father back to health after his father gets hit by a car. But on that first day in 1955, Marty sees his dad about to get hit by a car, runs out there, pushes him out of the way, and takes the blow himself. And now he's faced with this problem. I've disrupted the way they're supposed to meet. How do I get my parents to meet and fall in love? Because if they don't meet and fall in love, then Marty ceases to exist. With his future now at risk, he enters into a sequence of hairball schemes to try to fix his problem and ensure his survival. It's a funny movie, and although none of us are likely to be transported back through time any day currently, it makes me wonder, what kind of crazy things would I do if I really thought that my future was at risk? It's the same kind of thinking that a Hebrew woman named Rachel does in Genesis chapter 30. We are in Genesis chapter 30, verses 1 through 24 today. We are in a series called And God Remembered. If you're new or if you've missed a couple of weeks, here's what we're talking about. We're exploring Old Testament passages that use this specific phrase that says, God remembered so-and-so. 2 weeks ago, we talked about Noah and the flood and the ark. And God remembered Noah and all those animals, and so he rescued them out of the flood. Last week, we talked about Abraham. God remembered Abraham, and so he saved his family from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Today, we're exploring a lady named Rachel, who finds herself faced with this problem of an uncertain future. So Genesis chapter 30, verses 1 through 24. When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I'll die." Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God, who has kept you from having children?" Then she said, "Here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her, so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her." So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. Then Rachel said, "God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son." Because of this, she named him Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won." So she named him Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "What good fortune!" So she named him Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, "How happy I am! The women will call me happy." So she named him Asher. During the wheat harvest, Reuben went out into the fields and found some mandrake plants, which he brought to his mother Leah. Rachel said to Leah, "Please, give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Wasn't it enough that you took my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too?" "Very well," Rachel said. "He can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." So when Jacob came in from the fields that evening, Leah went out to meet him. "You must sleep with me," she said. "I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he slept with her that night. God listened to Leah, and she became pregnant and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, "God has rewarded me for giving my servant to my husband." So she named him Issachar. Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, "God has presented me with a precious gift. This time my husband will treat me with honor, because I have borne him 6 sons." So she named him Zebulun. Sometime later she gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and said, "God has taken away my disgrace." She named him Joseph and said, "May the Lord add to me another son." This is the word, believe it or not. This is the word of the Lord. Praise be to God. I'm glad that y'all were laughing while we read through this scripture. This scripture is supposed to be funny. It's a comical story, or at least it's intended to be. In fact, the entire story of Jacob is largely a humorous story. Early in life, you probably remember this already, early in life, Jacob leaves home and goes to live with his uncle, Laban. While there, he falls head over heels in love with Laban's daughter, Rachel. But there's a problem. She has an older sister named Leah. And according to Laban, it would look really bad on the family if his younger daughter marries before the older daughter is married. So the conniving uncle cooks up a little scheme. Laban agrees to let Jacob marry Rachel if Jacob works for 7 years as his hired hand. Gentlemen, do you love your wives that much? To work for her 7 years? They agree. Jacob works his 7 years, but on their wedding night, Laban pulls the old switcheroo. When Jacob goes off to his honeymoon bed and lays down with his wife, he wakes up expecting to see Rachel. Instead, he sees Leah laying in his bed. He's accidentally married her. Alcohol wasn't as condemned back then as it is now in Baptist circles. I'm sure that played a part in this. He then works another 7 years to marry Rachel. Gentlemen, do you love your wives that much to work 14 years for her hand in marriage? Jacob does. 3 cousins, 2 wives, 1 husband. Whew. Needless to say, they were in need of a little marriage counseling. Maybe your own family doesn't sound so dysfunctional after all. The Bible doesn't try to hide the tension either. Jacob loves Rachel. She was beautiful. Scripture says that she had a lovely figure. From the moment Jacob laid eyes on her, he knew she was the one. It was a match made in heaven. Everybody said so. Everybody said they were the perfect couple. They were high school sweethearts, prom king and prom queen. And then there was Leah. Ugly. Plain. There weren't a lot of boys coming round for Leah. None, actually. She stayed home on prom night. She might have even been a spinster, hadn't it been for her conniving father. Yeah, Jacob, even though they were husband and wife, Jacob didn't think all that much of Leah. Maybe that's why God allowed her to have all those kids. 6 sons and all. Maybe that's why God allowed her to bear so many. Otherwise, she would have been completely forgotten about. And I suspect she knows it. I suspect that Leah knows that her only value is in producing sons for Jacob. After she has her first son in the previous chapter, she even says, "It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." And then she had another, and another, and another. She just kept on popping them out. 6 sons. 6 sons in all she gives Jacob before Rachel even has one. And sons are a big deal in Israelite culture. Did y'all notice that when it came to the daughter, she had one little bitty sentence? All these sons, and they have these big names. God's really blessing me, so here's my son, and he has some special name. And then there's Dinah. There's Dinah over there. Yeah, he had another. It was Dinah. Sons were a big deal in Hebrew culture. The Hebrews, you see, they didn't believe in life after death. The Hebrews didn't believe in a heaven. Once you died, that was it. The only way that a person really lived on was through their kids. God blessed you if you had a descendant and a family line living on in the land. That was heaven. That was how you lived forever. You had a dynasty. Without a descendant, there was no future. But without that male child to carry on your name, there was no future. And just as much as Leah knows her leverage, Rachel knows her dilemma. "Give me children," she says to Jacob. "Give me children or I'll die." The story may be recorded for our comedic entertainment, but for some reason I doubt that Rachel is joking when she says that to Jacob. Yeah, when the future is at risk, a person can do a lot of crazy things. What kind of things might you do if you really thought that your future was at stake? Driven by uncertainty, Rachel begins trying to force her future to happen now. She tries to force the future in the present. She decides that the best way to go about it is to give her slave girl, Bilhah, to bear Jacob's child, as if that's really the solution she's looking for. As if that's really what God had in store for her. She even gloats in verse 6, God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son. She sounds delusional, doesn't she? That's the statement of a crazy person. A sane person knows that's not really what she wants. It's not really what she's after. It's not what God really wants. And I think she probably knows it. I think she knows it deep down because she keeps trying and keeps trying and keeps trying. But that's the kind of thing that we do when we think that our future is at risk. We try to force the future we want instead of waiting on the future God wants. Have you ever spent much time in the waiting area? It's not a fun place, is it? Nobody likes sitting in a doctor's office in that waiting area. 1 hour, 2 hours, 2.5 hours. What's he doing back there? Nobody likes the waiting area. A couple was on their honeymoon. They went to the airport to catch their flight. When they arrived at the gate, they were told by an agent that they would need to wait a little while. So they made their way to a spot in the waiting room and they took a seat. They were put to the side but hadn't a clue why, and people soon started boarding. With every person who boarded before them, what do you think happened? Couple became a little more and a little more annoyed. What a way to start our honeymoon, the husband mumbled to himself. After a while, annoyance turned into frustration. Go up to the counter and see what the holdup is, his wife urged. Still more and more people boarded while they just waited, and soon that frustration turned to downright anger. I'm about to go give them a piece of my mind. The husband said, you're not going to do anything, his wife said. Finally, when every other passenger had boarded that plane, their names were called. The couple scurried down the jetway and looked for on their boarding passes where their assigned seat were. They walked through economy, but they couldn't find a seat, any open seats in economy. That's odd, the wife said. I could have swore this is what we paid for. Is someone in our seat? Dear, are we even on the right airplane? Yes, we are. They entered business tentatively and looked around. Still, no seat was found. There was only one section of the plane left. They poked their head cautiously into first class, and there they were. 2 open seats. Much to their surprise, they had been upgraded. A courtesy of the airport for their honeymoon. Frowns gave way to smiles, frustration to joy. They quickly realized that sometimes, sometimes waiting isn't all that bad. Rachel had to learn it the hard way, and I suspect that she's not the only one. I think a lot of us probably do it too. But don't try. Don't try to force the future you want, because the future God wants is always worth waiting for. But Rachel's anxiousness gets the best of her again. Once more, she forces the servant Bilhah, by the way, who I think is the real victim in all this. That's the one I really feel sorry for in here. She forces Bilhah into Jacob's bed. Again, the slave girl conceives, but Rachel's reply, notice it's a little different this time on baby number 2. It's a little different. This time, her motivation seems to reveal a hint of envy and covetousness and headbutting with her sister Leah. In verse 8, she says, I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won. Really? You've won? Again, just like that first reply, isn't there something a little delusional and crazy about her thinking here? She hasn't won anything. These aren't really her children at all, but she decides, or she begins to do what a lot of us do when our future isn't shaping out the way that we thought. She darts after someone else's destiny. That's what she does. She sees what somebody else is or what somebody else has, and she says, hey, I want that. I want that person's destiny. And little does she know that God has something really special in store just for her. Little does she know that she's about to be the mother of Joseph. Joseph, one of the patriarchs of Israel. Joseph, the child who God's promised, the inheritor of the dynasty. It'll flow through Joseph. It was a destiny far better than anything she could ever steal. And she doesn't even know it. And anxiousness about her future makes her dart after someone else's destiny. And that's the problem with wanting something that belongs to someone else. That's the problem with coveting another person. It makes us chase a future that God doesn't have planned for us. And if we chase that future for too long, it starts to turn us into a person that God never really intended us to be. We become like the rose tree in that poem, Envy. Y'all heard about the rose tree in the poem Envy? The author says this: the rose tree is not made to bear the violet blue, nor the lily fair, nor the sweet mingonette. And if this tree were discontent, or wished to change its natural bent, it all in vain would fret. And should it fret, you would suppose it never had seen its own red rose, nor after gentle shower had ever smelled its rose's scent, or it could never be discontent with its own pretty flower. Like such a blind and senseless tree as I've imagined this to be, all envious persons are. With care and culture, all may find some pretty flower in their own mind, some talent that is rare. If God created you to bear roses, don't go chasing after violets. That's the bottom line of the poem. Have you ever known a person that's gone chasing after somebody else's destiny? I have. I've worked with the pastor before that so much wanted to be like Louis Giglio. Y'all know who Louis Giglio is? Louis Giglio is one of the top 10 preachers in the world. He's awesome. He's one of the best preachers ever. And this pastor wanted to be just like Louis Giglio. He wanted to be on a platform as big as Louis Giglio's. He even started dressing like Louis Giglio, wearing skinny jeans just like Louis Giglio, wearing shirts a little too tight, just a little too tight like Louis Giglio, started cutting his hair just like Louis Giglio, started preaching and talking on stage just like Louis Giglio. And he couldn't do it well. He couldn't do it well. And he was chasing somebody else's future, and it turned him into a person he was never meant to be. Today, he's not in ministry. And that's what happens when anxiety and uncertainty about your own future get the best of you. You start chasing somebody else's future, and it turns you into somebody you were never meant to be. God had a future in store for Rachel. It was unique to her. Could it be that God also has a unique future in store for you. Don't wish for lilies or for violets when God made you to bear roses. Don't dart after anybody else's destiny but your own. But uncertainty gets the best of Rachel once more. The next thing that she does is she makes a bad trade. She makes a bad exchange. She trades her man for mandrakes. Now, this is the part of the story that gets a little PG-13. In the ancient world, mandrakes were thought to be, I had to do a lot of digging to figure this out, by the way. Mandrakes were thought to be a type of aphrodisiac. Mandrakes were a sort of love potion number 9 in the ancient world. It was supposed to increase sexual appetite and achievement. So this is why Rachel is so desperate, you see now, to get her hands on these mandrakes. She's trying to get pregnant, but you know what will help you get pregnant faster than a love potion? How about spending the night with your husband? Right? That seems like a more logical step to me than going after an aphrodisiac that you found in downtown New Orleans. But that's what she does. The anxiousness has consumed her so much that she trades her night with Jacob for a magic bullet. It was a bad trade. She trades her man for mandrakes. Leah, on the other hand, she'll make that deal. She takes the night, and look what happens. She gets pregnant twice. For a bad trade, to quote our president, this has been the worst trade deal in the history of trade deals, maybe ever. Sometimes we are our own worst enemy. We are our own worst enemy when it comes to following God's plan for our lives. Occasionally, God has us right where He wants us. But then we go and we make a bad trade. We trade the man for the mandrakes. Have you heard about the college admissions scandal? It's been all over the news for the past couple of weeks. Several families across the United States, if you haven't heard, were caught in a major cheating scam to help their children get into college. Cheating on the ACT and the SAT scores, fudging it with the university so it looked like they got higher scores so that they could get in to the college. 50 people have already been charged and are now facing a prison sentence, up to 10 years in prison for this cheating scandal. And it's not just parents and students either. It's several of the admissions employees at some big universities. Yale, Stanford, UCLA, UT, they're all involved. The more surprising thing about this story to me, though, as I was reading some of this, the most surprising thing to me was that they didn't need to do it. They didn't need to commit these crimes. Most of these families were wealthy families. Money wasn't an issue for these families. Several of them were celebrities. They weren't in desperate situations. They didn't have to make these deals. It's not like they were starving to death and had to go steal bread just for their family's survival. That most likely, these students would have gotten into a university. It may not have been the university quite of their choosing, but most likely they would have gotten in somewhere. I got in somewhere, so if I got in somewhere, surely they could have got in somewhere. So most likely, their future would have been A-okay. Their future would have been just fine. But they went and they made some bad trades. They traded man for mandrakes. What causes a person to decide to lie and cheat and scheme. I mean, the only thing I can think of is they must have really thought. They must have been convinced that their future really was at risk. They must have really thought the future is uncertain for my kids and their lives, so I have to do that. Otherwise, I don't know why they would have done it. We can do some pretty crazy things, can't we? When we think that the future is at stake, when the future feels uncertain, we also have the temptation to move things around like we're playing this giant game of chess. But the only chess master of the future is God. That's the only one who can play chess with the future. Can you trust Him enough to direct your paths? Can you trust Him enough? Don't trade the man for the mandrakes. And so what does all this have to do with God remembering? Where does that all play a role in all this? Even though Rachel has made some bad choices, God still moves in her life, doesn't He? God still helps her. Although she's tried everything she can think of to control and direct her own future, she tried forcing it. She tries darting after somebody else's destiny, and she's traded her man for the mandrakes. God still remembers her. God remembers and allows her to conceive a child all on her own. God remembers. And because God remembers, what I think this passage is saying to us, because our God is the God who remembers us, it means that you don't have to worry about your future. Because God remembers you, you don't have to run around like a chicken with your head cut off. Because God remembers you, you don't have to make one bad decision after another. You don't have to try to force the future to happen on the terms you want it to happen on. You don't have to chase something that belongs to somebody else. You don't have to make bad trade deals that get you into more trouble. You don't have to have anxiety about your future because God remembers. He remembered Noah and all the wild animals, and He brought them through the flood. He remembered Abraham and the prayers of Abraham, and He saved Abraham's family from destruction. He remembers Rachel, and He says, I have a future for you. Don't you worry about a thing, because I remember you. If you'll allow me a little liberty with the old hymn, Because He Lives. But what if we sang Because He Remembers? Because He remembers, I can face tomorrow. Because He remembers, all fear is gone. Because I know He holds the future. And life is worth the living just because He remembers. Will you pray with me?